Welcome to Lunch with the Lord. I'm Pastor Mark, and we're beginning a new book of the Bible this lesson, an Old Testament book, a book that I've read several times, and I'm sure you've read it also. It's the book of Esther, very beautiful book. And as I said, I've read it several times, but I've never really dug into that book and really studied it. But I'm doing it now, and I'm going to share these lessons with you. I'm studying it verse by verse, literally. And I'm learning a lot of new things and a lot of great things about God in this letter. So we're going to be starting here. This first lesson is going to be the introduction to the letter. Now, why is this important? Because yes, you can read a letter of the Bible, read one of the books of the Bible's Numbers or Deuteronomy or, the book of Isaiah, and you can read these books and be blessed. But it's better if before you start reading these books of the Old Testament or of the New Testament, that you read a little bit of background on these letters. And it'll help you to appreciate the letter that much more. Who was it written by? Why was it written? Who was it written to? Under what conditions was the letter written? And then when you read the letter, you will have much more deeper appreciation of that letter. So that's why we're going to go into this introduction on the book of Esther. So we begin by saying that Esther is her Persian name. The name Esther is her Persian name, and it means star. Now, the Greek word for Venus is Esther, A-S-T-E-R. And Esther was named after Venus. Now, Hadassah is her proper Hebrew name, which means myrtle. The book of Esther is dealing with those Jews who were still living in Persia and did not return to Jerusalem after Cyrus decreed that they could go back. King Cyrus decreed that they could go back approximately 60 years before Esther, the book of Esther, took place. And some of them went back to Jerusalem, some of them didn't. And the book of Esther deals with those Jewish people who did not go back to the land of Israel, go back to Jerusalem. Now, the book of Esther takes place between the books of Ezra and the book of Nehemiah. So in historical setting, it's the book of Ezra first, then the book of Esther, and then the book of Nehemiah. Now, let's look at some chronology first, all right? In 536 BC, it's the first Jews are able to go back to Jerusalem under Zerubbabel. All right, under Zerubbabel. The first Jews, remember, the children of Israel were taken into captivity by Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon in 605 BC. And now, 70 years later, in 536 BC, Cyrus gives the decree that the Jews can go back to Israel, they can go back to Jerusalem, and they can begin to build the temple, all right, and the city. And so in 536 BC, the first Jews begin to go back to Jerusalem under the leader Zerubbabel. Now, in 516 BC, the temple is completed. And in 476 BC, Esther becomes queen. So again, approximately from 536 BC, from the time the Jews are able to go back to Jerusalem, And to the time Esther becomes queen, it's approximately 60 years later. Now, in 473 BC, which is 3 years later, Esther helps to save the children of Israel in the Persian Empire. All right, she helps to save her people. Now, in 455 BC, Ezra returns to Jerusalem. And then in 445 BC, Nehemiah returns to Jerusalem. All right? So, there are 2 books in the Bible where the name God is never mentioned. Now, do you know those 2 books? Well, the first one is Esther. The first is Esther. And the second one is the Song of Solomon. Now, who wrote Esther? Esther, it's not exactly sure, it's not exactly known who wrote the book of Esther, but it is believed that it was written by Ezra. But again, it's not 100% sure who wrote Esther. And when was it written? It's believed that it was written between 430 BC and 332 BC. Now, in 332 BC, Persia was overthrown, so it couldn't have been written after 332 BC. Now, because Esther, the book of Esther was written during the time period where Persia was enjoying, great glory, then it seems that the book of Esther was written, what took place somewhere around 400 BC. All right, somewhere around 400 BC is when the book of Esther takes place. Now, the key word for the book of Esther is providence. Providence, all right? Meaning to provide in advance. Now, providence is the continuous act of God by which he oversees and overrules all aspects of his creation, with the result of being that God's overall will come to pass. So, yes, the world is continuing, but God is overseeing all things that are going on in the world. And eventually, God will make sure that in the end, his will come to pass. And this is the providence of God. And we see that here in the book of Esther. Now, providence means that God is intricately involved in all people's lives, saved or unsaved. God is intricately involved in every single person's life, in the history of this world and in the direction that they will go. So God is interested in every person's life. God is interested in the history of this world and in the direction that both of them go. Now, there are 3 aspects of the sovereignty of God which mankind is able to see. Now, the first aspect is creation. All right? And creation, of course, is the existence of the universe. The second one is preservation. And preservation is the continuation of all that God has created. So first, God creates. Secondly, now he preserves. And thirdly is providence. All right? The third aspect of the sovereignty of God is providence, which means that it's the overall progress and development of all that God has created. So first, God creates. Secondly, he preserves. And thirdly is God's providence, which God oversees the progress and the development of everything he created. Now, Romans 8:28 is basically the theme verse for the book of Esther. And Romans 8:28 says, "And we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are called according to his purpose." And you'll see that all through the book of Esther. God started the book of Esther when he brought Esther's mother and Esther's father together. And he used their DNA and designed Esther to be a very beautiful woman. Her beauty was given to her for a purpose. All right? Her beauty was given to her for a purpose. It wasn't given to her, for her own vain ideas and for her own vain thinking. No, her beauty was given to her by God for a purpose. Now, the book of Esther focuses on three main feasts. Now, the first feast is the feast of King Ahasuerus. All right? King Ahasuerus has a feast in chapter 1. That's the first one. The second feast is Esther's feast. All right? And then the third feast is the Feast of Purim. The Feast of Purim. And this book of Esther centers around these three feasts. Now, as we study this book, I will not make the main emphasis of these studies to be on types. These studies will not be type studies. All right. Now, you may say, what do you mean by that? What I mean is that you will find study sources out there that will say, well, Esther represents, like the human spirit, and Haman, he represents the human soul or whatever, and Mordecai represents Jesus Christ or the Holy Spirit, and this represents that. King Ahasuerus represents the human spirit. All these things, and then they go through the book and they start relating these people to these types. And look, that's good in its own sense. And you can do that with the book of Esther because there are great parallels that you can bring with, in types. And you can have good teachings on that. But I wanted to basically take a step back, and all I wanted to do is to study the book for what it says. I don't want to study the book for what it doesn't say or what it may mean in typology, but I want to study the book of Esther basically for what it says, and I want to focus on the providence of God in this book. So we will be studying this book for what it really teaches, and what this book really teaches is the providence of God. You don't see the name God anywhere. God's not mentioned anywhere in this book. And yet you see the hand of God everywhere. Now, that saying, when I say that I'm not going to speak on types, there will be times when I do use types in order to teach a specific lesson or a lesson of life. And you'll see that. So I'm not contradicting myself. You'll see as you go through these studies. I will be teaching some types, but only how it applies to us today, not the whole book in type. All right. So the main focus of this is to teach the book for what it really was meant to be, and that is, it's a book of the providence of God, how God saved, how God used people's lives to save the children of Israel from destruction. And that's what this book is about. All right. So we're going to start chapter 1 next lesson. But until then, walk with the Lord. I know he walks with you.